the World in 80 Days. Chapter 18, The Tankarde. It was risky to attempt to reach Shanghai in that season of the year. The Chinese seas were dangerous and terrible storms threatened during November. But John Bunsby believed in the Tankarde, which, in his words, rode the waves like a seagull. Late in the day, Fogg and the others sailed out through the channels of Hong Kong. The Tankarde, encouraged by favorable winds, conducted itself admirably. John Bunsby had high hopes for the journey and assured Mr. Fogg that they would reach Shanghai in time. When they got into open sea, Phileas Fogg said,
"Captain, I'm sure that I do not need to ask you to use all possible speed."
"Trust me, Your Honor. We have raised all the sails the wind will allow,"
said the captain. Phileas Fogg, with body straight and legs apart, stood like a sailor at the bow of the boat. He gazed at the swelling waters without staggering. Aouda, who sat further back, looked out upon the ocean. The boat, carried forward by the wind, seemed to be flying over the waves. Fix, seated below, kept apart from his fellow travelers. He did not like to talk to the man whose favors he had been forced to accept.
"Once in the United States, what should I do?"
he asked himself.
"Should I abandon my man? No, 100 times no. I will not lose sight of him for an hour."
Mr. Fogg and Aouda ate with good appetites that evening. Fix was invited to share their meal, which he accepted reluctantly. To travel at this man's expense and live upon his provisions was distasteful to him. Still, he was obliged to eat, so he ate. When the meal was over, he took Mr. Fogg aside and said,
"Sir, you have been very kind to pay my way on this boat, but I must ask to pay my share." "Let us not speak of that, sir,"
replied Mr. Fogg. Fix was determined.
"But I insist." "No, sir,"
repeated Mr. Fogg.
"I consider it part of my general expenses."
Fix bowed, returned to his cot, and did not speak again that evening. At daybreak the next morning, the wind began to blow harder. The sun had set in a red mist the night before. John Bunsby had studied ocean weather long enough to know what it meant.
"We are going to have a rough wind,"
the captain said to Mr. Fogg.
"Is the wind north or south?"
asked Mr. Fogg.
"South. Look, a typhoon is coming up,"
said the captain.
"I am glad it's a typhoon from the south, as it will carry us forward,"
said Mr. Fogg. The captain took precautions and tied up all the sails. The top masts were put away and all hands went forward. A single triangular sail of strong canvas was hoisted at the bow to keep the boat from turning into the wind. Then they waited. John Bunsby had requested that all passengers go below, but Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and Fix chose to remain on deck. None of them wanted to feel imprisoned in a narrow space with very little air while the boat bounced about. The storm and rain started around 8 o'clock. The Tankarde was lifted like a feather by a violent wind. The boat flew northward, carried by monstrous waves. The Tankarde was almost submerged numerous times by mountains of water that rose behind it, but the skill of the captain saved the boat. The passengers were often bathed in a cold spray that was whipped by the wind. Fix cursed it. Aouda kept her eyes fastened on her protector, whose coolness amazed her. As for Mr. Fogg, he acted as if the typhoon was just part of his plan. The Tankarde kept steady on its northward track. The night was a terror, and it was a miracle that the boat did not sink. Twice the boat would have gone down if the crew had not been constantly on the watch. Aouda was exhausted, and more than once, Mr. Fogg rushed to protect her from the violence of the waves. Day reappeared, and the tempest raged just as fiercely. By noon, there were signs that the wind was calming, and the night was comparatively quiet. Some of the sails were raised, and the Tankarde moved forward with speed again. The next morning at dawn, the passengers could see the coast of Shanghai. The wind and waves had grown much calmer. At 7, they were still 3 miles from Shanghai when a long black smokestack, crowned with a plume of white smoke, appeared on the waters near the coast.
Blast our luck!
Cried John Bunsby.
The Yokohama steamer has left the port. I heard that was quite a rough storm Mr. Fogg experienced. I'm glad I missed that leg of the journey. I would have gotten terribly seasick. Imagine going through all that and then missing the Yokohama steamer. Yokohama was a small fishing village from the 8th century until the 19th century. In 1854, the Americans arrived with warships and demanded that Japan allow international trade. In response, the Japanese made Yokohama a port where foreign ships could dock. Raw silk, tea, and many other products were traded through Yokohama, and this little town was transformed into a city. Many Western influences first reached Japan through Yokohama, including the country's first daily newspaper and first railway.